It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners and welcome to The Two Jacks. It's episode 18 of our merged program where we introduce topics Australian and overseas, put them all together and round it up with a bit of sport and silliness at the end. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack, all the way in Hong Kong. How are you, mate?
Yes, the last remaining city in the world to require a mask mandate. But I believe the rumour is that it will be lifted tomorrow on the 1st of March.
Still indoors, but not outdoors. Is that
in some locations indoors? Healthcare facilities, etc., but not general. And they're probably going to recommend it on public transport and stuff. But we've been in the embarrassing situation where visitors from the mainland have had to reacquaint themselves with a mask mandate because they haven't got one over there.
Very strange. Of course, we looked at the Cochrane study last week on the program, which sort of indicates that masks don't do a whole lot. Now, there's been some dispute about that from scientists, and there should be in any sort of peer-reviewed process. But it would seem that it is more important to have clean hands than a mask on your face, Jack.
It is. There should always be dispute in science. That's what the whole nature of the beast is. The other big news here from Hong Kong is we've had a particularly grisly murder.
Do tell.
A young model, mid-20s, perhaps late 20s, they've charged the ex-father-in-law and the ex-husband with her murder. They found a pair of female legs in a refrigerator and a large pot of soup which seemed to contain human remains on the stove.
Dear. A bit of cannibalism going on there, Jack.
Well, I'm not sure if they were trying to dispose of the remains. And
make a stew.
Make a stew. The father-in-law was arrested on a pier out near the airport with 500,000 honkies in cash and a number of Rolexes worth about $4 million, and he was waiting for a speedboat to head to the mainland, I think.
So the motive would seem to be some form of jealousy that she'd taken off.
This is a real Hong Kong story. This is a dispute over the ownership of a very expensive flat in Kadoorie Hill.
Oh dear. And
apparently the flat was bought by the model, but in the father-in-law's name.
And he'd be looking at a decent stretch. What's the maximum for a grisly murder, Jack? We're talking about life as life.
Well, we did have the chap who the English fellow of Eastern European background, who was a trader and who was coked up and managed to kill 2 young ladies from the bars in Wan Chai, and he had one stuffed in the suitcase on the balcony, the remains thereof, while he was murdering the second one. So he got life, basically. So never to be released.
Never to be released. No death penalty in Hong Kong?
No.
Okay. All right. Because if there was, Jack, you might be looking at... I do recall there was a wonderful sort of documentary called Shanghai Vice that ran on the ABC. I don't think they knew quite what to do with it. It ran very late on a Sunday night. And on the mainland, of course, if you fell afoul of that sort of grisly business, you were marched in the courtroom. You were pretty much found guilty straight away. And then you had an appeal, if you were given the death penalty, automatic appeal the following day, and a bit of a shake of the head and off you go.
Yes.
Is that true, by the way? I always thought it was a myth that the Chinese government will send the next of kin an invoice for the bullet. It sounds a little bit too much.
I've never quite believed that. No, I've read the same stories, but I've never quite fallen for that one.
It seems a little bit too much. Look, we're going to move on. We're just
and of course, disclaimer here: no one's been found guilty of this yet.
No, yes, innocent. The presumption of innocence runs, of course. But I'm going to have a look at that. That does sound very fascinating. We won't spend a lot of time on Mars, Jack. We did that last week. We've got some readers' letters here. An old mate of ours from the JTI blog at the Australian has got in touch. Ray, I won't get into his surname, of course. Sorry, Ray. He's known to you as Baseman.
Yep.
Look, he dropped me a lovely little line about his cricketing prowess. He's become a good player since he's retired. And
haven't we all?
Haven't we all? That's right. But he wanted to make a very good point about sudden cardiac arrest. It seems to be sort of, it's like if you listen to anti-vaxxers, no one's ever had a heart attack before. And we have this sort of annoying hashtag of died suddenly. But people have been dying suddenly for a long time. In fact, as long as people have been about. But Baseman wanted to talk to us about the coronary calcium score as the most important thing. And he talks about a very simple test that's available through a cardiologist. He talks about the stats. 1 Australian dies every 12 minutes. Poor bugger. Sorry, that's an old joke.
You must be getting sick of it by now.
That's right. Yeah. So 1 Australian dies every 12 minutes of a heart attack or some vascular disorder. And Ray has just gone through the process of having a calcium test. His figures weren't great, but they weren't too bad. But he wanted to recommend that to our listeners, particularly of a certain age. As we talked about last week, I hit the scales about 121 kilos, and I said, perhaps I should just start walking it off. And they said, for God's sake, don't exercise straight away. Go and have a stress test, which I ultimately did, and lost a bit of weight after that. So yes, it may well be that I'm certainly not a cardiologist. I don't recommend this, but Ray at least suggests that if you are of a certain vintage and you're wondering whether you should make some lifestyle changes and do a bit of exercise and that sort of stuff, perhaps, or just in general, you should go and get a coronary calcium score test and consult with your GP and your cardiologist about that to avoid that sort of sudden moment that shocks us all. Another letter we've got, Jack, it contains 2 topics, and both from Lawrence, one of our beloved readers, Farmer Lawrence, we call him. And we'll start with topic 2. He heard about a report from Europe that an average family in Slovenia is now considered better off than the average family in the UK. Can't vouch for its veracity, he says. It wasn't a US World Affairs podcast I listened to. With the continuing post-Brexit hangover, political gridlock, the decline of basic services like Royal Mail, trains and NHS, rumblings from the Scots about independence, that probably won't happen now. Can the UK get its act together? Something to watch out for. Dissatisfaction in the rural areas. Farmers very unhappy about free trade deals, losing EU subsidies, but not the red tape. Jack, we have heard, just in relation to this, that tomatoes, cucumbers, capsicums, etc., are now being rationed through many supermarkets, through the chain supermarkets in the UK. There doesn't seem to be any real cause for it, but, well, in terms of those vegetables are plentiful in Europe, but not so much in the UK. Is that a consequence of Brexit? Is that a consequence of some of the supply problems that come with Brexit?
I think the immediate cause of it was frosts and problems in North Africa, where they've been getting a lot of their vegetables from.
That's right. They do come. A preponderance come from Algeria and Morocco.
Yeah.
Those types of vegetables, fruits, I think indeed a tomato is called. But it would seem that the rest of Europe's okay now, but not the UK.
Yeah, it's a bit slower. I did see a wonderful little meme a little photo on the net of a dirty white van in London, and someone had used the wet finger on the back to write, "No tomatoes kept in this van overnight."
Well, Yes, I did speak to a mate of mine who lives in London, and I asked him if he'd like me to send him a bag of tomatoes, and he declined. So he says he'll be right. But yeah, there clearly are some issues that arise from Brexit in terms of supply. It would seem that while there might be shortages of goods from time to time, Europe will get them quicker than the UK will. Topic one we'll get to now from Lawrence, and that's Israel. And with a new coalition government with some very right-wing, ultra-Orthodox factions, legislation drawn up that a simple majority in the parliament can overrule the Supreme Court. Talk of settlement expansion, suspected of bombing a factory in Iran. Is this going to blow up into major unrest? Well, let me just stop you there, Jack, because it more or less has, hasn't it? There have been protests on the streets in Israel, Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem.
Yep, politics in Israel is a vigorous pastime. It's contact sport.
What's Benjamin up to, mate? What's he doing? What's he up to?
Well, I think he's trying to placate the more extreme ends of his coalition before he gets on with the rest of it.
Yeah. What's happening? What's happening with his prosecutions, Jack?
Don't know.
I think it's all been sent away. I mean, it's all very odd. Do really the right-wing ultra-Orthodox factions, do they represent your common or garden Israeli, Jack?
No, they're a minority, very much a minority group. But if you need them to form a coalition government, you've got to give them a couple of little carrots.
Yeah, indeed. It would seem that it's a coalition of about four parties, including some quite heavy ones. Yeah. All right.
I just must say, I should have listened to Bassman myself, to be quite honest. I mean, I've been keeping a couple of cardiologists here in Hong Kong.
Yes. Yeah, well, you haven't died suddenly. That's the main thing, Jack. With question marks over whether the vaccination has caused your death. Of course, it's all bloody nonsense. Of course, people have sudden cardiac arrest all the time, and there is a good way to prevent it, and Ray's brought that to us, and we thank Lawrence Dew for his letter. Meanwhile, in Australia, Mardi Gras, Jack, you would remember various Mardi Gras while you were in Sydney. It's a great time to be in the city. I used to drive off to a game of cricket very early on the Sunday morning after Mardi Gras, Jack, and it was always a beautiful scene, beautiful tableau of Sydney at its finest. Men lying in the gutter face down with their chaps on and what have you. It was always a great indication. But a fun time was had by all, especially Lydia Thorpe, Jack.
Yeah, I believe I saw a little clip of this, that she was protesting against the police participating in Mardi Gras. Is that correct? Yes,
and just to show how serious she was, she waited for the police float to go past and then jumped under the truck of a group called, I think it's called 20 something, who provide support for LGBTQI youth, homeless youth. And so that's a very genuine sort of charity. It would seem that her role as a politician is becoming more performative as we speak, Jack. Is this the only way she's got to have her voice heard in that very small group of Indigenous Australians she claims to represent?
Pretty much it is. This is the nature of minority politics, that you pull stunts.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? We might remember Nick Xenophon. He used to get dressed up every now and then and turn up to a press conference in various costumes. Whatever was going on. It seems she certainly copped a fair bit of criticism from the Mardi Gras organisers, who said they didn't mind her protesting, but they were pretty unhappy with the way she stops trucks and so forth. And they indicated there was a potential safety issue. she made her way back onto her feet without the assistance of police. And then she started waving her arms around a little bit, Jack, and I thought, oh, here we go. But the police were very, very, very good about it and just simply, I think they very quickly gave her a moving on order and escorted her from the Mardi Gras precinct. But, yeah, waving the arms around in front of the Wallopers, you've only got to make contact and you've got a few problems. The thought did occur, Jack, that she might have had a couple of sherries before the and I have no basis for this, but I did see a tweet from her earlier in the day where she was wishing everyone a happy Mardi Gras, and then she wasn't so happy herself later in the day. And the thought did occur she might have had a sherry or two.
Do you mean she was like 90% of the other people there?
Yeah, well, that's right. But all those people stayed behind the barricades. That's the difference. And maybe this is the only way she can get her protest across, but I would have to say on the balance of Twitter responses to the tweet that she popped up there, she claimed that Mardi Gras was essentially founded by black women and black trans women, and there is simply no evidence to support that. But on the basis of that tweet, she copped a shellacking in response.
Quite a lot of the founders of Mardi Gras didn't make it through the AIDS problems in the 80s and 90s, but there are enough of them around who can still disprove that.
Yeah, enough of what we call the 78ers. And I think there were 53 or 55 who were arrested and taken back to Darlinghurst Police Station and given a nice old touch-up there. And then the Sydney Morning Herald, Jack, published their names and addresses and occupations in a report the following Monday.
There is a great untold story, I think, of the gay community, the gay male community in Sydney from that time through the AIDS epidemic. It doesn't appear in print anywhere, but if you speak to the people who are part of it, it's an extraordinary episode in Australian life. It's a story that should be told.
It's a good story. It's a very good story, very powerful story. I mean, and the police really didn't hold back in that 78, that very first march. The New South Wales Parliament had apologised to the 78ers and particularly those 50-odd people arrested. And the Sydney Morning Herald, I think in 2015, offered an apology to those people for essentially doxing them. Many people lost their jobs. Many people were rendered homeless. A number of people were kicked out of their rental properties and what have you. It's not a glorious history, but it is history that should be properly understood. Lydia, as for Lydia, we can expect more stunts, Jack?
Oh, absolutely.
I think that's the way it's going to go. Meanwhile, Jack,
politicians are politicians. They never stop trying to get re-elected. So that's what she's doing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a problem with it. Although her take on the founding of Mardi Gras was, just way away from the truth. But look, I don't really have a problem with her doing these sorts of stunts as long as they're not endangering people. Superannuation speculation, Jack, if you look at our papers, you will see a great deal of op-ed thumping about superannuation. Money will be stolen from our accounts, all this sort of stuff. And we don't even really know what the legislation's going to do. There's no draft legislation. It's really a discussion point, I guess, with the budget coming in May as to what changes might be made to the tax benefits that people in very high superannuation deposits might have. There are 11,000 people in Australia with superannuation deposits or accounts or balances, I should say, of 3 million plus. That's a nice retirement, Jack.
I think that the 11,000 is a higher figure than that. I think it's about 36,000 with 3 million plus.
36,000. Oh, well, I beg
with
to differ.
3 million plus.
Well, I don't beg to differ.
The 11,000 is 5 million or 10 million or something. So.
I think there's someone there, just one individual with nearly $1 billion, nearly $500 million, I should say. So, what are we getting so upset about, Jack?
Well, I think we should wait until we find out what they're really planning to do. Would be one
Would be
thing.
sensible, wouldn't it?
I read Robert Gottliebson's daily column on this this morning. But
full of outrage.
I think they're all, like a lot of things. You've got to keep adjusting these things to counter people's use of existing schemes to play funny buggers.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess when it comes to reform, you're going to basically, unless you get the legislation absolutely right, you're going to create other opportunities for tax minimisation, aren't you?
Yeah, this has got to be done carefully and in a considered way. But look, I think there is most Australians retire, men with a superannuation policy of about 150k and women about 100 because they miss some years having children, etc. And yet there are, as I say, 11,000 people with very large super funds and 36,000 ones with very big ones as well. So.
And not paying a cracker in tax on those big...
the cost of the tax concessions for super, Jim Chalmers is saying, is $50 billion a year.
Yeah, and it becomes unsustainable. And this was actually addressed by Josh Frydenberg when he was Treasurer. That it becomes unsustainable as we go into the future. It becomes unsustainable. But I just have enjoyed the hysterics in the op-ed pages. The Daily Telegraph went with coming for your money sort of headlines and all this sort of stuff, completely baseless because they've got nothing to hang it on. Yeah, all right.
They may in the future, but they don't right now.
Not a thing. But this is the price of reform in this country. And when it becomes absolutely necessary, as it would appear to be in this case, unsustainable level of funding, Commonwealth funding or Commonwealth money going to people who are super rich. This is the sort of thing you can expect. This is why reform's almost impossible in this country.
Yeah, I actually think this is a winnable argument for the government to say, look, the people with $10 million plus in super or the people with $5 million plus in their super funds can't get all of the benefits, all the tax concessions that people with $150,000 do.
Yeah.
I think that's a politically winnable argument because there are very few of them, It's just got to be pitched right.
You need to have the courage to communicate effectively. Whether Chalmers and Albanese have got those skills, I would sort of say Albo's pretty good, but he does suffer from timidity at times. And Chalmers seems to be a decent debater, but they need to get very solid lines of communication out there. When they release their decisions. So when they release their decisions, that will be around budget time, by the way.
Yeah, so you look at people who've done this well in the past. Hawke and Keating did it well. John Howard did it well. They went out and said, this is what we're going to do and this is why, and they were successful.
Okay. Well, John Howard did pipe up. Jack, his eyebrows are getting extremely bushy these days, but did pipe up there, Jack, with the Middle Australia won't cop this. And you think, that's got nothing to do with Middle Australia. Not at all. The Voice, Jack, and we'll continue along with this as we go every week. Frank Brennan has released his proposed draft wording for the referendum in a new book on The Voice. Jack, you want to give it to us?
Yeah, Father Brennan says his proposed wording is, there shall be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice with such structure and functions as the Parliament deems necessary to facilitate consultation prior to the making of special laws with respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and with such other functions as the Parliament determines. Now, the difference between his proposal and the current one from the Prime Minister is that it doesn't provide for the voice to make to have a constitutional right to make representation to the executive of the government, that is, to the cabinet and to public servants.
It's a bit of a mouthful, though, Jack.
And secondly, it restricts the constitutional right to make recommendations
to the Parliament,
to the special laws with regard to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not to the whole of the law.
But as a referendum question, if this was put to the people, I just think it's just too long.
It's about the same. It's about the same length as the Prime Minister's.
Oh, I think it's a bit longer. But anyway, Brennan has argued his words limited the obligation for the voice to be consulted for laws made under the Constitution's race power, while allowing the Parliament to extend the scope beyond this through legislation. But Noel Pearson, one of the architects of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, is not happy with that form of words and said, and with due respect to Frank, who does have my respect on legal matters, I look at the article in the Australian Financial Review by the former Chief Justice Robert French, which was, in my view, a really clear outline of why these issues are very, very tight in the draft wording that is there. Oh, so that's actually Albanese.
Yeah, it said that.
Sorry,
yeah.
I do apologise. But where does Noel fall on Brennan's words?
He says that, look, we took this and had a chat to the conservative parts of the working groups, and they agree with what we're trying to do. I don't think that's altogether clear, but there's a whole lot of arguments about who said what to whom and when. Frank Brennan says that the proposal that the Prime Minister put forward was the 18th version that was put forward and didn't go through the right process. But all that doesn't really matter. What's really needed now, I think, is that they've got to get everybody in those working groups on board with what they want to do, and they're not doing that at the moment.
Okay, so we're still working on the form of words,
and exactly where it fits in the Constitution. Brennan was talking about Bob Ellicott. You remember he was a federal Liberal
Attorney General in the Fraser years, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. And he was responsible for 3 of the only 8 successful referendums in Australian history. And Bob Ellicott had a view that for a referendum proposal to have a substantial chance of acceptance, it should contain no element of possible substantial confusion on legal or other grounds. I think that's very good advice.
Indeed. So Noel has weighed in, and we should be listening to Noel all the time. His point basically is that the wording has been submitted and accepted, going all the way back to 2014 by constitutional conservatives, Jack.
Mm.
Meanwhile, Gary Johns, who is the Secretary of Recognise a Better Way, the Voice No Case Committee Incorporated, he wrote an inquiry in the Australian that what is known about the proposed voice so far amounts to a shadow government. That's not true, Jack.
I don't think it's necessarily true. It could end up that way if it's badly handled.
Gary Johns, it has to be remembered. I don't know.
A Labor minister.
Well, yes, he was, but he also wrote a column for the Australian where he proposed some very radical measures that might be, and I'm being very cautious about my words. I know Gary, I've spoken to him a number of times, being very cautious about my words, but he suggested that Indigenous affairs in this country were broken, and what needed to essentially occur was, I'm being very, very careful about this, a form of eugenics, Jack.
Oh, I don't recall reading that. He's certainly been on a bit of a journey since his days as a Labor minister. I'll put it that way.
He has traversed the linear ideological spectrum to some degree. Of course, I had a little bit to do with him when he was running the charities and not-for-profit group in Canberra. In another essay and inquiry, constitutional experts Megan Davis and Gabrielle Appleby responded to claims the draft of the constitutional amendment will give rise to litigation in the courts. They described the concerns as disingenuous and overblown. So we've just got so many voices saying so many different things, Jack.
Yes. Yeah, and what Brennan says is that what the government's got to do is to be more open and transparent about what's happening and why, and I think that's correct. And he says they've got to get and release advice from the Solicitor General, and preferably run this through a parliamentary committee so everybody can have their say and we can work out what's a doable way forward.
And I think Murray Gleeson has also weighed in, Jack.
Yeah, and Gleeson gets to the nub of it in a sense. He says, how does it offend some principle of equality now to provide that in recognition of the unique position of Indigenous people in the nation's history, Parliament shall establish a representative body which has a particular function of giving advice about such laws? And you know, this is sort of how many angels on the head of a pin sort of theological argument as to what the exact wording should be. But the real question is, does it advise the executive? Does it just advise Parliament? And which parts of it are constitutionally entrenched and which parts of it are subject to legislation and therefore can be changed?
Well, as Muzza said, mate, and he's Muzza to me because we actually wrote about him. He's a good bloke, actually. Really good bloke, really down-to-earth sort of bloke.
He's Eric Barner's father-in-law.
Is he? Is he?
Yep.
I did not know that. He said, it is difficult to see, this is the former Chief Justice of the High Court, it is difficult to see any objection in principle to the creation of a body to advise Parliament about proposed laws relating to Indigenous affairs and specifically about special laws enacted under the race power, which in its practical operation is now a power to make laws about Indigenous people. And Noel has replied to that. Noel Pearson has said, Mr Gleeson's speech is the last word on the legal integrity of the voice and its seamless compatibility with the constitutional history of the Australian Commonwealth. And we might just wrap it up there, except to say that's not exactly the way it's going at the moment. There are a number of voices on the voice that are not on the same page.
Yeah, at the moment, if I was having a bet, I'd be saying it's about a 40% chance of success.
Needs more work. All right. New South Wales state election, Jack. We did tell our listeners last week that we'd have a bit of a look at it. And we've got a news poll.
About a month to go?
Yeah, it's really quiet. Actually, while I was streaming some stuff from Foxtel, it's the first time I saw a Labor Party ad. And first time I saw an ad full stop. So it's been really quiet. Now, a news poll is showing the coalition making a little bit of a comeback with 30 on the last weekend, February 20 to 23, so an extended weekend when the polls were taken. Coalition primary vote at 37, Labor 36, Greens 12, others 15. That on two-party preferred. On a calculation made of recent federal and state election, puts Labor in front 52-48.
Which is pretty much the margin for error, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. It'll be about 3%, so it could go the other way. But Peretay's performance has just been lifted a little bit. Men's satisfaction rating has just gone down a point. And as better Premier Dominic Perrottet sort of rules that by about 10 points against Minns. But when we get to the question of whether the coalition deserves to be re-elected or not, we've got 36 saying yes, they do, and we've got 48 saying it's time to give someone else a go, with 16% uncommitted.
That's where it looks to be to me. You know, I don't think the Liberal government's been a terrible government, but I think people think they've been around too long, and it's time to shake the place up a little bit with a bit of change.
Yeah, there have been some bad missteps in transport. You know, they bought trains that won't fit in the tunnel. They've made some fairly serious fairly serious and embarrassing editors as public administrators, but overall, you'd probably give them a pass mark. But they've been in.
It might be a bare
pass,
time. But a pass.
Yeah, that's right. And look, I've looked at the pendulum, and Labor needs 9 to win majority government. Needs to win 9 seats in the lower house, and I find that very hard to get to a point. But I was talking to a former Labor staffer, a mate of mine, on the weekend, and he said he was at a dinner with Morris Yemmer, and Yemmer is, it must be said, very skilled in the nuance of New South Wales electorate, and he ran through the 9 pretty quickly that they thought they could win. So we'll see. I continue to look at the pendulum and say, where are you going to get the 9 from? But it may well be that we have minority government. There could be a Labor minority government. That's on the cards. Having said that, statistically, it's less likely than a majority government either way.
Yeah, I'm getting the same sort of feedback that Labor's reasonably confident. But I must say that Minns hasn't cut through as much as I thought he would. He's very presentable.
It's so quiet. There's really just not a lot going on. Now, I'm actually in a bit of a swinging seat, Jack, and not a lot going on, not a lot going through the letterbox. Not a lot going on in terms of advertising. I don't watch, to be fair, a lot of free-to-air television, but I did notice a Labor Party ad popped up on Foxtel streaming, which is an indication that they don't want to pay the full freight just yet. We're less than a month away, and of course the polls will open. I think 14 days before the election date itself, or 13 days before the election date itself. So it's kind of creeping up on us.
Yeah, I was expecting Minns to be better known and to have cut through much more by now, I must say.
Yeah, look, I would have thought so. He looked very, very good in the latter half of last year, but just hasn't really made much of an imprint since. Yeah, we'll see.
I thought he was a racing certainty about then, but he's got to the front and started to get the wonders.
Because he is in the most marginal seat of all. Cogra is held by about 1,200 votes. Now, I'd expect him to win that pretty comfortably, but it's the coalition and independents have been coming along and one by one have sort of stood away, so he should win that comfortably. But it's rare that you see a leader, a major party leader, in such an uncomfortable spot. Now, Jack, we've got to talk a little bit about your man love for Waleed Ali. You seem to become a very big fan of Waleed.
I wouldn't say I was a fan of Waleed's. I find the project just about unwatchable when he's on that.
It used to be bad, and it's just got worse.
Yeah, he's just a little bit too smug for my taste. But
well, he's the smartest one there by a country mile, but that's not saying much.
No,
he's the smartest one on the panel by a long way.
It's not a Group 1 field, is it?
No. Waleed's really just having a run before something more serious comes along. But look, he does cut through with some of his writing, and I think this would have come from the Nine media, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it came from the Age, this bit, and this came up. This struck me because I was talking to a pal who's got children in their late teens and early 20s, and he was describing something similar. He says, young people, particularly with young people, liberal notions like free speech and tolerance are being asked to give way to acceptance and representation. In this approach, the trouble with freedom is that it provides the freedom to, say, be a bigot. This new progressivism wants to assert a moral orthodoxy, but the only morality it can imagine is one about politics and power. That's why, even as it opposes liberalism, it cannot escape its terms, categorising all manner of things as harmful or unsafe. My pal was telling me that even around the dinner table, there is just so little tolerance that if someone has an opinion that they disagree with, people are getting up and leaving the table and storming out all the time.
But is that different? I mean, is that really different? I don't know that it is. I'm very sceptical about any of this sort of generation gap sort of stuff, Jack. Going back to the time when I was a very intolerant human being in my early 20s, and if I didn't like what I heard, I'd let you know.
That must
I don't
have
think
been,
I don't
must
think
have
much
been,
has changed there.
must have been entertaining with your father because he was pretty firm in his
Used to
views
cop
as
a
well.
spray. I mean, there is that sort of ardent. That ardent nature of youth, and that will pose no criticism. I mean, I think it's always been us, hasn't it? You know?
Yeah, I think that's true, but there's a wider lack of tolerance. And I saw on the Twitter this morning that the half of the NRL CEOs don't want to have anything to do with Pride Round this year because of what happened with Manly last year, and that's sort of a symptom of the same thing. I think we need sort of proper tolerance, and that means tolerance of opinions that you don't agree with.
Yeah, I know, but it's a hard sell, Jack. You know, and you've got. I mean, I think what we have seen through social media. I mean, social media through the internet, social media, this ability to connect with one another, which is a wonderful thing. It's also there is a downside to it, and that is this expression of opinions in echo chambers. That with groups dealing with their own Facebook page and Instagram page and all this sort of stuff, that it really does create an echo chamber. This is what I believe, and these people who are listening to me and talking and conversing with me online, they think the same things too. So that does create that sort of echo chamber feel where you actually come to the belief that and it's just the same thing with the sort of Cookerverse, where you actually come to that belief that you represent the majority, that your view represents a majority. Obit for Tony Burke.
That's precisely what I'm talking about. With the pride thing in the NRL, nearly half of the NRL contracted players are of Pacifica origins.
Yeah.
And nearly all of those will be conservative Christians.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they will have a different view about a pride round to the other half.
Yeah. No, I understand that.
And what you've got to do is have proper tolerance where we all tolerate our different points of view. You can't have either group imposing their point of view on the majority.
All right. Yes, we have to stand hand on heart and pretend that we enjoy Old Testament literalism. Okay. This is a wonderful obit for Tony Burke, age racing rider, and the old Siebel townhouse.
This is from Bruce Clark, who's on the telly and does the racing on the telly.
Yeah, I know, Bruce, yeah.
And you'd recall the Siebel townhouse?
I do, and I've got some stories, but keep going.
And he's talking about when Tony Burke used to go up to Sydney to cover the Sydney Racing Carnival. He would stay at the Siebel Townhouse. And for those of you who don't know, it was a wonderful, smallish hotel in Elizabeth Bay.
It was probably Sydney's most glamorous hotel for a long time.
Yeah. But it wasn't a huge hotel, but it was very glamorous. As Bruce Clark says, we're the rich and famous mixed with the Siebel. Had a little bar upstairs there. John the barman used to tot up the bar bills on a fool's cap page for all nights, and Tony Burke was happy totting up all his expenses to the age.
Yes, good old days.
Yeah, good old days.
Rivers of gold.
Yeah. Rivers of gold, yeah. And Bruce Clark's writing about a particular story that Tony Burke used to tell about staying there. And at the Siebel, all the famous people stayed there. All the music stars did, from Elton John through to Phyllis Diller. I think from my recollection is that Elton John got married from the Siebel townhouse.
Well, he got married in the Anglican church
in Darling Point,
and then
back to the Siebel Townhouse bar for afters.
There you go.
And there was a one occasion Tony Burke's talking about where a chap who Bruce Clark's described as a well-known musical identity. He doesn't call him a singer or a guitarist, so we'll have to work out who that is. And he retired early. He's a bit tired and emotional and gone up to his room and said, under no circumstances was he to be disturbed? And then the staff rang the room to not surprisingly get an earful, but returned with, "But there's a naked man saying he was invited to see you." And the punchline was the music man said, "Send him up immediately." And our regards to Molly Meldrum.
There you go. Yes, there you go. Look, I know the Siebel by reputation rather than visits. I do recall it being there, but I don't think I've ever walked across the threshold. But it was also a bit of a meeting place of a few, shall we say, duckers and dodgers around the Cross area. Abe Saffron used to enjoy the drinks there, although he'd complain about the prices. And it was a bit of a knockabout. Plenty of gangsters used to go through the doors there as well.
Well, there were a few places around the Cross that were like that. No, was it the Aqua Club or whatever it was around the corner from the Siebel?
What's the one I'm thinking of? I used to go to another one around the corner, sort of nightclub sort of thing. And spend a bit of money there and get well looked after, and there was plenty going on there.
It was a very lively place when I first moved up to Sydney.
Yes, indeed. All right. So, valet to the great racing rider Tony Burke, who in the good old days of newspaper reporting enjoyed himself heartily at the Siebel Townhouse. Russia and Ukraine, Jack. We'll go through the peace process. Have we reached the quagmire there yet? I'm not entirely sure about that. Because I believe that the delivery of Abraham's tanks will change the nature of the battlefield, but that won't be probably until the middle of this year. They won't arrive. They can't just arrive and you just jump behind the wheel and off you go. You need a bit of training, so that's going to take a few months as well. Yes, so supply and then training.
Yeah, it's not like going down to Hertz and picking up a rental.
You can't just pop the keys in the ignition and off you go. And a little bit of kit inside that you need to get yourself across, yeah. Mm. But they are much faster, longer range weaponry, and likely to have a significant impact on what might well be a quagmire at the moment in East Ukraine.
Yeah, as it happens, it's just on a year since the start of the war, and people tend to take the opportunity under those circumstances to say, well, where's it going? What's going to be the end result? And everyone's jumped in this week and done that, including a journalist in the Kiev Post who... and apologise for saying Kiev. I'll probably be...
Kiev, please.
Kiev,
yes.
Kiev, yeah. I'm just wondering when the waiters are going to say, how would you like your chicken Kiev?
Kiev, It should be chicken Kiev.
It's like Turkey. Nothing's Turkey anymore. It's Turkey.
Turkey, yeah. Well, that's right. I did look into this, and one of my friends and a man known to you, Pat Shear, was most upset with the establishment of Turkey. But this was an insistence from Erdogan. The trading company or the export groups had sort of hammered away at the government, Erdogan's government, to say, can we stop calling the country Turkey, please? Not least of all because it is a synonym for an idiot, a turkey, particularly in American vernacular. And so it was Erdogan who just handed down this decree that it become I think Turkey Federation is the full term. And the US State Department accepted it, I think, late last year, in December of last year. And that's why when we see coverage of the earthquakes, in particular in Turkey, we see this. The ABC went with it first, Turkey. SBS, I noted, had stayed with Turkey, and now they've moved over to Turkey as well.
It's always both Kiev and Turkey are always enunciated very clearly. One suspects there have been workshops at the SBS and the ABC on how to pronounce this correctly.
Well, Pat sent a nasty letter off to the ABC Communications Department, and they replied that this was the proper form. They're actually right, by the way, because a country can call itself whatever it wants to be. Thailand used to be Siam, Jack, but we don't call it Siam anymore. And the Indians, of course, have renamed many of their cities. Mumbai was Bombay, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, these things happen.
Anyway, the chap from the Kyiv Post, he thinks there's 4 possible outcomes. Ukraine will win and restore its territorial integrity within the borders of 1991.
Well, that includes
two.
So that obviously includes Crimea.
Yep.
Yeah.
None of the parties can win, and the front will stabilise in pretty much where it is now. Option 3, Russia is defeated in the war and ceases to exist as a sovereign country.
Ooh.
And option 4, Ukraine is defeated in the war and ceases to exist as a sovereign country.
I think both of the latter two options are fairly unlikely as I see it. I think the most likely one for me is that the Ukrainians will push back the Russians beyond the February 2022 border. I think that's quite likely, and then peace discussions can occur. But of course, this week, Jack, the Chinese have weighed in with how many points in that plan?
12-point plan.
12-point plan. And they're all pretty vague, aren't they? All of those 12 points, they're all pretty vague, aren't they?
Yeah. Do you reckon McKinsey wrote that one? It looks a bit like it, doesn't it?
It does a bit. It's kind of an all thing to all people sort of option. It really doesn't mention anything. It does talk about the possibility of, well, it talks about sovereignty without making any real claims about it. It does talk about freedom of Russia, but doesn't make any claims about that either. I mean, is it a starting point?
Oh, look, I suppose it is. Meanwhile, in Europe, they've been pushing and shoving the same thing around. I think it's fair to say that no one in Europe believes that the Ukrainians can take back Crimea, and they have grave doubts that how far they can push the Russians back from the present line of dispute.
Yeah. So, I mean, at the base of this, you have an invading country. Russia invaded Ukraine, and at what point do you have to say, well, we're going to give you some of the land you stole? You pounded our cities. You've killed an estimated 100,000 people, civilians, killed an estimated 100,000 civilians, and you're going to be rewarded with some land for your trouble. I got a real problem with that.
Yeah, well, likewise, but then you've got to be practical and say, well, they won't give it up without a fight, and can the Ukrainians win it back?
Yeah, I think we need to. I honestly don't think they should be talking at all until the European summer. Anyway, the Wall Street Journal has reported that what we might call the Western nations or the Western European forces in NATO are basically dragging Ukraine in as a way to encourage Kyiv to start peace talks with Russia.
Yes, I think last Friday, Zelensky said that the atrocities committed by Russia over the past year make such talks impossible.
It does make it very difficult, Jack. 100,000 citizens going peacefully about their business, having either subject to air raids or artillery barrages or rockets or missiles pounding into their cities and killing them. I mean, I don't think this, principally or on principle, I don't think there's anything to be said here other than. I mean, I just go and ask the Poles. The Poles just saying, let's go to Moscow. Let's go. Let's get it on.
Zelensky reminded people that before the invasion, he had repeatedly urged world leaders to press Putin for a meeting, and the Russian leader refused. Now it is us who cannot do it, Zelensky said. There is nothing to talk about and nobody to talk about over there.
There you go. Well, that does sound like a stalemate. If we have a quagmire in eastern Ukraine, that's certainly a diplomatic stalemate, isn't it? All right. So the 12-point plan from China, it's a framework, isn't it? I guess that's what we could say about it. It's a framework on which there might be some discussion at some point in the future.
Yep.
All right. United States, Jack, over to the States. 1 year out from the 2024 primaries. There's a Fox National survey on the presidential nomination races. Spoiler alert, former President Donald Trump looks formidable while President Biden faces doubt. Republican primary voters were read a list of 15 announced and potential candidates for the 2024 nomination. Trump tops the list with 43%. DeSantis, 28%. Nikki Haley and Mike Pence at 7% each. They won't make it through 2023 in the primary. And Greg Abbott and Liz Cheney at 2% each. I don't think Liz has announced her candidacy, nor has Greg Abbott, although neither has Pence for that matter.
Nor is Ron DeSantis either, but we know.
Well, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah. No, he hasn't.
But we know he's running. He's holding fundraisers and all that sort of stuff. So,
yeah. Look, are we just looking? Are we just looking at sort of recognition, voter recognition here? An expression of that. I'm a bit sceptical about some of this polling. The more we read about Trump, the less likely it would seem that the Republican Party and its sort of grassroots really want to bar of him. 37% on the other side of things. 37% of Democratic primary voters want to keep Biden as their party's nominee. A majority of 53% says they would like someone else to run. Someone else. That means anyone else.
I think if you put a couple of names there, the number 53 would drop pretty dramatically.
That's right. It's always that's just the way of polling, isn't it? You're basically, once you put some hard names in there, that'll drop away. I mean, if Biden decides to go, I saw him of course, he visited Kyiv, Jack, last week. And he's looking very stiff in his movements. I don't know if you saw him wandering around the streets of Kyiv with President Zelensky. He's looking very stiff and, I don't know, physically, I don't know. Physically, and I guess there are questions about his mental competence as well. But
he does walk like a wind-up toy these days, doesn't he?
It's robotic. He's not a young man, but if he decided to run, he would basically. I doubt that he would be challenged in the primary, would he?
Yeah, I suspect he might be challenged, but he might well win. But I don't think he or Trump will be there myself.
We did see, of course, that a number of Fox News' personalities in matters released in regard to the Dominion voting machines action, Jack, $1.6 billion. So they're claiming from Fox News and others, $1.6 billion for Rudy Giuliani, One American News. I think there's another news network in there. Who else? Giuliani. The My Pillow guy, Mike Lindell. They're all subject to these massive actions, and the News Corp one is underway, and with sort of release of texts and emails and so forth from Tucker Carlson and others, Lauren Ingraham, Sean Hannity, etc. So we don't believe this. We don't believe this. What Trump is asserting at all. And we think Giuliani's a clown, but then they go on their talk shows and have a go, Jack. Pretty strange. Do you think it'll cost them? The News Corp defence is one of basically a freedom of speech argument that they were more than entitled to discuss these things.
Yeah, I think that will succeed myself.
We'll see. It would be.
Certainly, the freedom of speech rules in America are stronger than they are in Australia, and you're allowed to be wrong.
Yeah, you're allowed to be wrong, but are you allowed to be knowingly wrong? That you knew this was a problem. Now, I really don't want to say, but I would conclude that people like Lindell and Giuliani have got bigger problems in regard to this particular suit.
Yeah, they may do, but I think I don't think News Corp's got too much to worry about.
Well, I hope not. Okay, so January 6th video footage was released to Tucker. A group of news organisations on Friday asked House Speaker Kevin McCarthy to share thousands of hours of security footage from January 6th after Fox News host Tucker Carlson said this week that he has been given access to about 44,000 hours of video from the attack on the Capitol. Only went for 6 hours, Jack.
They must have a lot of cameras there, is the answer to that.
Must have a lot, about 7,000 of them by the looks of things.
This has caused quite the kerfuffle in the US, and
please explain.
And my view is, yes, let them all have a look at it.
Yeah. In fact, it's hard to understand why this has not happened
Already. Yes.
Yeah.
And it hasn't happened already because Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker and wouldn't release it. But it should. Don't just give it to one news organisation. Make it available to everybody.
Indeed. And I couldn't agree more on that one. I don't think there's too much to be discussed there. The Georgia grand jury, too. It would seem that I don't want to add to Rudy Giuliani's woes, but I would see him probably being the number one most likely to be indicted, and Trump may be there as well. And this has become a little bit complicated by the fact that the former foreman of the grand jury has come forward. Foreperson, I should say, absolutely, because it's actually a woman who's come forward and just enjoying her 15 minutes worth of fame, which will cause all sorts of problems with any future indictment.
Yeah, one would think so. She's a quite odd person, I think a fair assessment would be.
Yeah, but she's enjoying a little moment. She was locked up as a juror for about 6 months, so she's enjoying a bit of clear air and the sun shining. Yeah, so we will see, but certainly. The prospects of anyone being prosecuted diminished with her public performances in the last week or two.
Yeah.
In Nigeria, I had a quick look to see what updates there were in the Nigerian election, most populous nation in Africa, Jack. But when we look at GDP per capita, it is well and truly down the list. You know what's number one, Jack? Do you know what's number one in terms of GDP per capita in Africa?
Oh, no, I don't.
Botswana,
yeah.
Small population, and they made some pretty good decisions along the way economically.
But Nigeria is the biggest country in Africa, and,
it is.
And 220 million people. And the last I saw this morning was that they're holding an election, and the last I heard this morning was that the opposition parties had walked out of the tally room, what we would call a tally room, in protest over the use of an electronic voter system that's supposed to transmit the votes from the remote communities into the tally room, and they are distrusting that.
Yes, this is the first time the Nigerians, and the first time in Africa, that a electronic voting system has been used. So we're seeing that it's 220 million people in Nigeria, only 87 million eligible voters, Jack.
Yeah, it's a bit odd, isn't it?
It doesn't seem quite right. But this is probably the biggest election in the country's history in terms of how it will shape its future. Peter Obi from the previous little-known Labor Party battling out with Mr. Tinubu from the ruling All Progressives Congress, and Atiku Abubakar of the main opposition People's Democratic Party are all seen as potential winners. There are 15 other presidential candidates, and a candidate needs to have the most votes and 25% of ballots cast in 2/3 of Nigeria's 36 states to be declared the winner, Jack. Gee whiz, I thought the American system was complicated, but that is very complex. And now the major opposition parties have basically stormed out of the of the tally room, as you say, and that doesn't augur well for any sort of peaceful settlement to the camp.
No, it doesn't. There's a possibility of a runoff in 21 days if no one gets that majority.
That looks to be the case. And gee whiz, electronic voting systems, Jack. What do we say about them?
Yeah,
I don't want to fall foul of Dominion voting systems here,
exactly.
but you cannot beat the paper and pencil for mine.
Yeah, the stub of HB pencil and a bit of paper. Yep.
Yeah, and there's always a record. There's always that piece of paper. All right, in Iran, Jack, women, particularly in Tehran, are saying no, thank you to covering up, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of flack.
No, it looks like they've won the battle over the hijab, over the compulsory wearing of the hijab.
I have not worn a scarf for months. I don't even carry it with me anymore. Whether the government likes to admit it or not, the era of the forced hijab is over. And that was from Akimia, a graduate student in the Kurdish city of Sanandaj, quoted in the New York Times. Even many religious women who wear a hijab by choice have joined the campaign to repeal the law. Mariam, 53, who observes the hijab law and lives in Tehran, recently travelled with her daughter to the holiday island of Kish in the Persian Gulf. They were surprised to find most women wearing short-sleeve sundresses, sandals, capri pants and T-shirts. Are we in Turkey or Iran? Asked her daughter, who was 26. So it looks like that at least that battle is over. I mean, what does that tell us about the regime, Jack? Are they that worried? They must be.
They are.
It's shown they've shown to be an oppressive bunch of bastards with protesters, and we believe more than 100 people have been killed, have been summarily executed or subject to extrajudicial killings, and a number of people have been hanged most recently. But as any autocratic regime sooner or later discovers there's only so many people you can hang, if the majority's against you, you're in deep trouble. We've been following Vietnam a bit, Jack.
It's the coming growth spurt area.
It's the next monster, isn't it, in Southeast Asia? US Department of Commerce, the US imported $101 billion worth of goods from Vietnam. Yes, imported from Vietnam, that's correct. $101 billion worth of goods. To put that in perspective, Vietnam's exports to the US equal a quarter of its gross domestic product. They're growing rapidly. As recently as 2018, the US only imported $49 billion in goods from Vietnam. In 5 years, they've doubled. Moreover, Vietnam runs a huge trade surplus with the US, or that won't please the Donald, will it? Yeah. You have to be mouthing off about that. With the US, America's 2021 exports to Vietnam totaled only $11 billion, Jack.
They're expecting a GDP growth of about 8% this year, Vietnam.
Wow.
If you've got a lazy 10 or 20 million, you want somewhere to invest it, head to Ho Chi Minh.
All right. Very, very good advice, I think that is, Jack. And also a beautiful place to visit, isn't it? Just wonderful there on the China Sea. Now, look, I've just been keeping an eye on things, Jack, as we move on to sport.
9 runs to get.
Are they still short? They've got 2 wickets in hand. It is very, very tight. This is England playing New Zealand in Wellington, the second test there. What do they need? They need 9 runs now, Jack, with 2 wickets in hand.
Yep.
And that Jack Leach, who you would think can't bat at all, but he's quite stubborn with the bat. He's a 0 not out after 21 balls. Ben Foakes down the other end. Then we've got Jimmy Anderson after that. It still could be a New Zealand win. We'll see if we can get a result before we finish here. Very excellent game of cricket to watch.
Jack Leach's technique's all right. He just doesn't score any runs. But Jimmy Anderson is a number 11's number 11.
Yes, he is. I mean, look, he has hung around. I have a feeling he's got a test 50, and I know Leach has got a test 50 and maybe more than that. Look, just to give anyone who hasn't paying much attention, England absolutely smashed New Zealand the first test. Then in Wellington, they won the toss and batted. They got 435 declared for 8, and that included 186 from Harry Brook, who just spanked the ball to all parts of the ground. Joe Root, who's in outstanding form again, got 153 not out. And they scored their run so quickly. So they scored 435 off 87. Off 87 overs. It was just on five and over, which is staggering sort of scoring. And the New Zealand bowling was just found a little bit wanting. They don't have that strength in their fast bowling that they used to have. Tim Southee is a great player. He's the captain of New Zealand at the moment. New Zealand get into bat. They were at one stage I think they were 7 for 100 and going backwards very quickly. The skipper came out again, Tim Southee, and spanked the ball to all parts, got himself a quick 70 and had a little bit of support from the tail, and they got to 209, but still not enough to avoid the follow-on, which the Poms put them back in. And then New Zealand showed some real grit, making 483 all out. Tom Latham, Kane Williamson back in form at 132, Latham 83. Tom Blundell was the last to go for 90. And Devon Conway and Latham put on 149 for the opening partnership. So they gave him something to chase. I've got to quickly tell you, Jack, and I did let you know about this. Michael Bracewell, the offie, got run out behind the crease. So he actually was just jogging into the crease and didn't ground the bat and basically had his foot in the air, had not grounded his foot before he got past the crease and was run out in a ridiculous way. He could have, hung around and got him another 20 or 30 runs with Blundell, but that wasn't to be. It was one of the most shameful dismissals you'd ever want to see, and you'd like to think the coach would pull him aside for a quick word.
So just as we say, it's 9 down, folks.
Oh, there we go. So we got 1 wicket to go. Come on, go the Black Caps. Go the Black Caps here. I almost feel like we should stop recording and go and watch it. So Folks is gone, and Leach and Anderson will now try and get, what is it? I think it's about 7. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, dear. Well, we'll try and give you an end to that. I'm going to go and watch the highlights of that a bit later on. Been a great game. Enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah, the Bracewell run-out's one of the worst ones that we've ever seen.
Oh, shocker. Jesus, I mean, they could have got another 20 or 30, and that would have won them a game. I mean, it's as simple as that. But the mathematics on this is that there's a World Championship of Test Cricket that will be held in June. Currently on the ladder, Australia on top, India next. Actually, England are about 3rd or 4th. But if England win in New Zealand 3-0, and that's a real possibility depending on the outcome here and, of course, the third test. But if Australia go down, but Australia will also need to go down 4 in India, then England will go into the final with India.
Against India.
Yeah. Against India. Now, so Australia basically need a draw. Need a draw in India or a win. And England, well, they are playing excellent cricket. Bit of baseball, Jack.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how baseball goes in the Ashes in the summer.
Look, there'll be times when they get out for 120. And they're just told, don't worry about it. Because next time we'll get 420. We'll get 420 in a day and a bit. And
I think Australia have overrated themselves, but England are actually pretty good now. They've got a batting lineup with Joe Root, this new fella, Harry Brooks, who's scores 100 every second.
Yeah, gives it a real touch-up.
And Johnny Bairstow to come back in, and Ben Stokes. That's a pretty formidable, fast-scoring...
I don't know that there's too much room there for Johnny Bairstow, to be honest, mate. I mean, Ollie Pope's a hell of a good cricketer. Probably the weakness there is in the opening department, but look, it's a good, strong side. Their bowling is still relies heavily on Anderson and Broad. Leach is an improved left arm off breaker and more tight, bowls better lines and lengths than he used to. Look, it promises to be an excellent Ashes series, but Australia need to be on their toes if they're going to play in the World Test Championship. And we are not forgetting the women, of course, who won the Australian women's T20 side, who beat South Africa in the World Cup final on Monday morning our time, won pretty comfortably by about 19 runs. Again, I make the point, Jack, and this is, I reckon, the best sporting team, best team in any sport, any code, anywhere in the world at the moment, and have been for a long time.
Are they as good as the West Indies from back in the 80s?
Well, did the West Indies win back-to-back World Cups? They've won a Commonwealth Games medal in T20 cricket. They've won basically, I think 6 of 7 T20 World Championships. Their Test sides very, very strong. Their 50 over side is very, very strong. World champions there too as well. Look, we could argue about it all day. What I'm saying is this is definitely the best sporting side in Australia, and it may well be the best side in the world at the moment. We've got the third test starting in India. The men's going back to the men's again. They'll be bolstered with a few selections. I think Stark will play and Green surely must play.
Yes.
So it would seem that they'll whether they still play the 3 tweakers or not. They certainly do have that option. And if Green plays, they'll have a second seam option with Stark and be able to bowl the 3 tweakers, but it'll all depend on the pitch, of course.
I just hope we don't have the spectacle of the Australian captain and senior players out there spending an hour, poking and prodding at the pitch looking for demons.
They just seem obsessed about it, don't they?
Yep.
This is a long way from see the ball, hit the ball, but which is pretty much how Bazball works. They just seem obsessed about wickets at the moment or pitches, and they need to basically just concentrate on watching the ball. When we did see the second test, and as I said last week, who would have thought swinging wildly across the line wouldn't work on slow, low wickets in India? Good Lord. All right.
They actually seem spooked to me, is how I see it.
Oh, I think they got spooked. Look, Cummins has come home and we know that his mum is in palliative care now, and that's obviously taken a great toll on him emotionally. We wish him and her well, but he did look. We didn't know this at the time, but his innings of 1 ball and the second dig in India, you could tell there's a bloke who his mind was elsewhere.
And he wasn't bowling well either.
Hasn't bowled all that well. And again, I think he's got a decent excuse.
Exactly.
A bit of time away from cricket won't do him any harm at all. So, yes, we'll see if they play the 3 seamers, including Green, or whether they play the three tweakers, which is probably worth a go. Again, one bonus from this series is the arrival of Murphy as a pretty much ready to go off spinner.
Yeah, the lad from Echuca looks pretty good to me.
Does look good, doesn't he? An unusual looking cricketer with the glasses on, but
Worked for Dan Vittori.
He didn't do Bernie any harm either. He didn't like the contacts when he was, I think, batting. He didn't mind them when he was fielding, but he used to have the glasses on when he was batting sometimes, not always. Now, Jack, you're going to take us out as we wrap up. As we wrap up the show today, and I'm still keeping an eye on. They need 6 now, Jack. They need 6.
Do you remember Angela Davis?
Yeah, help me out.
She was the progressive darling, an African American woman.
Right.
She was at one stage arrested and charged with what today we would call terrorism offences, the killing of a judge to get somebody out of a courtroom. But she was acquitted of that. But she's remained, she's an academic these days, and she's remained as a darling of the leftish end. She was a former Communist Party member, lived in Moscow for a while.
Right.
And has remained a darling of the
Patrick Lumumba? Patrick Lumumba graduate?
Yeah, I presume so. The extreme left end of the black African American community. But she went on one of these genealogy shows. You know, the ABC has one. The ABC runs one in Australia, don't they?
No, SBS. Where do you come from? Yeah.
And if you get a look at it, it's quite the show, because she's sitting there when the African American host says to her that, you know, that one of your ancestors arrived on the Mayflower, the first vessel to arrive in North America from the UK. And it gets better than that. That's on her father's side of the family. On her mother's side of the family, she's actually descended from a slave owner.
But she arrived in America on the Mayflower.
Yeah.
Good Lord. That must have come as something of a shock to her.
It's a beautiful piece of TV, because it did come as a shock. She handled it very well, but it did come as a bit of a shock.
It must have, yes. It sounds like an episode from The Office where the boss there decided he was descended, well, found out that he was descended from slave owners. Not Michael Scott, but his subsequent replacement was descended from slave owners, and the rest of the office was demanding reparations.
Yeah.
We've got Titania. Who's Titania McGrath, Jack? You're coming up with all these sort of vague names. Who's Titania McGrath?
She's it's a satirical Twitter site run by an English comedian called Andrew Doyle.
All right.
He's he does push the limits quite a bit, does Andrew Doyle, in his guise as Titania McGrath, who's an intersectional, who describes herself as an intersectional post-feminist poet.
Right.
She writes the occasional column for the English press, and her photo is that she's completely white. But often compared to Rosa Parks, this is unsurprising given that I've worked assiduously and selflessly throughout my life in pursuit of equity and inclusion. The only difference is that I wouldn't be seen dead on public transport.
That's very good. And just moving on here, I have had some very good reviews of Cocaine Bear, which is sort of a slasher pick with a bit of heart, and it's actually the last film featuring a Goodfellas star Ray Liotta before he died. Yeah. And there's a bit of fun to be had there.
And the story is that in 1985, some drug smugglers were flying some cocaine into the United States, and they were crossing, I think, Georgia or Tennessee, when they decided that they were overloaded and tipped a bale of the coke out of the plane. And later on, a bear was discovered dead and had died of an overdose of the cocaine because the bear was helping himself. And that's a pretty boring movie, but pretty boring story. But they spiced it up a little bit by having the bear run around killing people in the movie.
That's right. Yeah, and apparently it's a good show. Apparently it's a very good show.
There's a lovely review in The Spectator by a woman called Deborah Rosso I hadn't heard of, and the best comment in it was quite what I was expecting. I don't know. Maybe the bear would become euphoric and chatty and stay up until the wee hours before becoming paranoid and crashing. That would have been more interesting, surely.
Oh, she's not your slasher pick fan, but yeah. Look, I'll check it out because of Ray Liotta's last performance alone. Yeah,
and the bear is the remains of the bear are stuffed in a museum in Kentucky, and he's known as Pablo Escobar.
Well, there you go. And got a bit of a sniffle before he passed away. Thank you very much, Jack. We're still going here. Jack Leach has got one run off 30 balls. He's obviously facing at this stage, and they need two. They need two. So we're not going to be able to give you the end of this test that I've watched. I've pretty much watched the second and third days in total. It's beautifully timed in Australia. Watch the NZ cricket because it starts pretty early, finishes pretty early. You can sort of avoid a lot of work that way. So it doesn't look like we'll quite get you a result on that one, listeners. But thank you, Jack, for your time today and explaining the world and how it's all working for us.
Yeah, pleasure to be here as usual.
And we just remind our listeners, I didn't give you the full blast from Ray, but Ray reckons he just loves the Two Jacks, mate. So he's a big fan. But we do remind our listeners to drop us a line. You can get hold of me on Twitter, and my DMs are always open there, Jack the Insider. And Jack, you're what do you call it? I don't even know what it's called.
Oh, I'm on Substack. Just look for Hong Kong Jack on Substack, and you'll find me.
Hong Kong Jack on Substack. So drop us a line if you've got any comments, thoughts, criticisms, of course, of the program. Anything, we'd love to hear from you. And that takes us out with England just needing 2 to win and New Zealand needing a wicket. We'll have to leave it there. I'll give you the result next week, but you'll know by then. Thanks, listeners.
Yep.
See ya.
Cheers.